Memories of the past are delicate things, roughly handled by the passing of time. A person's life can fade and be forgotten, but the flickering, moving pictures live on. The Reverend David Thorpe had been the vicar of a quiet West Coast parish before the chaos of the Second World War set him down on the harsh sands of North Africa. One New Zealander among the many millions of people caught up in World War II. But wherever David went, he carried his small 16mm movie camera. And this is his story. The first shots were taken before the war in South Westland and featured a close friend, a young Anglican vicar, Keith Harper. As the first rumblings of war were felt in New Zealand, David was chaplain to the Canterbury Yeomanry Cavalry. Men and horses prepared for a war that was to be so very different. When Padre Thorpe, fresh from New Zealand, arrived in North Africa in 1941, the war was going badly for the Allies. The New Zealanders were recovering from the defeats of Greece and Crete, and Rommel, the invincible desert fox, was advancing on Egypt. One of the Padre's roles was to encourage the troops and keep their spirits up. But what of his own morale? Could David hold fast to his own faith and find the strength to support others while surrounded by the depression of defeat and the bleakness of that desolate desert? It was to be a real test of faith. David's trial in the wilderness, and his faith sustained him.
I stood up there in the desert and said, well, Lord, I believe. I put all this in your hands, and I know that your power and love will overrule all this for God.
How did this man come to choose the difficult work of an army chaplain? What were the early influences that shaped his life? In the green and pleasant land of Little Akaloa on Banks Peninsula, David Thorpe was born. It was a quiet, rural existence. His parents were farmers, with strong family ties to the Anglican Church. Grandfather Thorpe, a parson, came out from Ireland in the 1860s. His maternal grandfather built and carved a parish church at Little Akaloa. David's father, in his mid-30s, left the land to train for the ministry. The beliefs of his parents were a strong influence on young David.
I remember as a very small boy, of course, becoming aware of the love of God through the unutterable joy my mother had of sharing prayer time with me as a very small boy. I remember going to evensong as a great privilege. My mother took me, I was about 9, and I was aware of the reverence of my father, of the awareness somehow of the presence of God. And I said to my mother afterwards, I want to be a minister, or I want to be like Father. And that really never left me, although I was, I suppose, a scallywag like other small boys, and I had to learn how to be sorry and to find God's love and forgiveness like everybody else. And I suppose that was part of my training for the ministry too.
A succession of remote country vicarages were home to the Thorpe family until David was sent back to his native Canterbury, to boarding school at Christ's College. A rare treat for the boarders was a day pass. On a visit to family friends, David met someone who was to change his life.
In the afternoon, however, after a lovely dinner, thank God for that for a boy at school, well, they're going to play tennis, and the dark-haired girl arrived, and her name was Roy de Pass. I thought she was marvellous. And actually we were at dancing classes together, the boys of Rangiru, the girls of Rangiru and the boys of college, and Miss Cox's dancing classes, and so I was able to get to know Roy and even hold her in my arms going round. For a boy, that was pretty good. But in those days, we were very much segregated. It wasn't until I was a student that I really came to know Roy de Pass. And she and I were very good friends. In the back of my motorbike, she came over to Cairns Bay to meet my parents and stayed there. And then we went up among the Manuka and the Tussocks, and I said, now, look here, will you marry me? And she said, don't be silly, I'm only 18, you're only 19. I said, never mind, will you? But she said, well, I couldn't marry a parson. Anyway. And it was years we were friends, and I always loved her, and I think she loved me. But then I had to be ordained. What would I do? Would I go away and be a farmer or something else? She couldn't be a parson's wife. But I had to go in a very lonely way and be a parson. But then she came down to stay with mutual friends in Timaru when I was a young curate. And she saw how positive and true and everything was. And the then vicar said, well, all you've got to do, be as well as you're able, a good Christian woman, and not do all the things that other people think. And so she became committed to me and to the life we lived. And that was it. We were together 53 years.
David and Rowi's first church was in Hokitika, and he shot his first film on a camera borrowed from the local dentist. The All Saints' Day procession, a special event in the life of the parish. A good friend, Keith Harper, visited his southwestern parish on horseback. In the days of David's father, this was a trek of over 300 kilometres. For Keith, the trip was not quite so arduous.
He said, now the south trip from the Fox Glacier down, I'm going to go down, would you like to come with me? And I was delighted because I was used to horse riding on the peninsula, and I thought of the days of my father, and so I put on my riding breeches and leggings and took my oilskin, of course, for the West Coast, and off we went. We came through the track from Bruce Bay through the Paringa. It's about a 40-mile ride through in the early days. Well, Keith and I rode all through there. He always took a tomahawk with him, and sure enough, a tree had fallen across. And we came eventually to the Fast. Now this enormous river is bridged. But then it took us an hour and a half to get across.
Once the horses were across the river, a second dinghy needed to be ferried back to where they started from for the use of other travellers following behind. It was one of the many difficulties of travel in remote southwestland.
We rode on down to Jackson's Bay. We stopped, however, at various settlements, and we would see how everybody's getting on and hear the news, and we'd say, would you like some family prayers or communion? And they were quite glad, or at least they said so anyway. But it was a very deep and moving occasion. And eventually we turned down and came back. We were a week in the saddle, we got wet every day, we got dried out every night, enjoyed every bit of it.
David and Keith returned from that testing journey, not knowing that a far greater ordeal lay ahead. In the late 30s, memories of the Great War were fading. But by now, there was the threat of another conflict looming. In Canterbury, the Yeomanry Cavalry was a territorial force of volunteers, a new generation of men and horses preparing for the threat of another war.
I was chaplain into the Canterbury Yeomanry Cavalry. She said, David, now you are vicar of Banks Peninsula, as I was once. Matter of fact, he christened me when I was a baby. And he said, they need a chaplain, and I think because I'm resigning. What about it? And of course I was delighted because I really loved horses, and the thought of being with those men out on manoeuvres with horses appealed to me.
First thing you ever attended to in the camp was your horse. You were second.
Yep.
I mean, you got up in the morning, you took your horse to water and fed it and groomed it. And if you had time, you had a wash, and that was generally in a water race somewhere or in the river. And after that, you got breakfast. But your horses, the animals always came first. And if you came in at the end of the day, your animal was attended to before you were. And all this was done on the call of a bugle.
Strict army rules. We had everything. So we had veterinary surgeons, and we had farriers, and we had the we had the lot there, and it was well, we thought it was pretty professional. A lot of these officers, they'd been in the First World War, and a lot of them in the mounted rifles, you see, and they weren't amateurs.
At the beginning of the day, we always began with regimental prayers. And the colonel would turn to me and say, "Carry on, padre." And there, top of my voice, with this great phalanx of horses, I would pray. And of course, I would pray for king and country, for our people. And of course, that's what it was all about, the concern for all our people. That's why we were there. And then, of course, the colonel would inspect parade, and then off they'd go on manoeuvres. That was the beginning of the day. And of course, they had training with rifles, with mortars, and machine gunners and so on. But also men had to learn how to deal with their horses during warfare.
Part of the training is ridiculous to think of it now in nuclear age. But we'd gallop into action, you see, and there was sort of competition between the teams. You had to, with the tripod, that, of course, they had to be whipped off the horse, a three-legged tripod thing. And the gun had to be popped on the tripod, you see. And you'd roar into action, see, everything had come off the horses, and then be one fellow's job to ride his own horse and take three back. Well, one day before they'd gathered up the horse handlers, a lot of these horses were real amateurs. I mean, they were farm hacks and old racehorse and all sorts of things. And anyway, the guns opened up before the horses had gathered up, and they remember they just took off. The funniest thing I've ever seen. There were just horses for miles in all directions.
So life wasn't all military drill and manoeuvres.
We had our evening fun, and as a matter of fact, I started boxing too. And we had boxing bouts between the different groups in the army. They brought out boxing gloves because I suggested it would be a rather good idea.
At this Mount Somers camp, and some idiot had persuaded me to go in for a boxing competition. Well, cut a long story short, I got really hammered and I was knocked out. My first memory of David, I'd seen him around, of course, was leaning over me asking if I was okay.
Wrestling, boxing, exercising horses, some of it may have seemed fairly light-hearted. But the awful underlying purpose was never far from mind. Preparation for mortal combat.
It's a remarkable thing. For thousands of years, horses have fought for men and with them, regardless of danger. And so you'll see in these sports, they're galloping along and with their lances catching a peg. And I presume in real life they'd be lancing some poor opponent.
The cavalry by. When war finally broke out, tanks, not horses, would dominate the fighting. But could the cavalry chaplain glimpse the extent of the conflict to come?
We became very much aware of Nazism and the threat of it, but I suppose we had no idea of what an awful global conflict would be, far worse really than World War I in some respects. We were following very much all the time the news and the decisions that politicians had to make, and eventually the final one.
War in Europe, but New Zealand's war too.
The war broke out, and I felt it was my duty as a territorial that I had to enlist. And I must say that I loved my wife and son very dearly, but I felt that I had a responsibility, and I enlisted.
My reason for joining up was this. I was a married man
And all the same, I say to myself, I suppose I'd be one of the fittest chaplains walking around New Zealand. And I thought it was my duty to fight for my country and my wife and 2 children. And that's why I went.
Oh, there was a mixture of patriotism and adventure, there's no doubt about that. And perhaps adventure would be the biggest percentage of the effort. So we decided this was the place for us. 21 rearing to go, must be a great thing. So we went and joined up.
As far as Keith and I are concerned, they did want chaplains, and men's needs are even more poignant when they're away from their wives and families and faced with all the trauma of war. And when I was chaplain to the CYC, I forget he was Major or Colonel Nicholl, he said, well, make the church service short, won't you, Padre? There's a very important ceremonial occasion coming on now. I said, well, look here, Arthur. What about all this rise of Nazis and this false belief that erupted up because people believed wrongly? The sort of things they're doing to Germany and to the world are because of wrong belief. And unless we keep sane and keep a right attitude to life, it's a waste of time going on and stopping them. We need to remember what life's all about. And after the church parade, he said, Padre, I'm so glad. I'm glad of what you said in that parade. You're right on the ball. And I think that perhaps gives meaning in our particular case, going as chaplains.
For David, part of the price of going away with the troops was the wrench of parting, leaving the warmth and love of his family, not knowing for how long.
We embarked on the New Amsterdam, a 40,000 tonner, and we left Wellington, and I'm sure my wife and family were there and were able to just see me as that great ship went out. It's hard for people these days to realize what it meant for our country. Oh well, if I went.
The New Zealanders arrived in Egypt, and for the Padre cameraman it was a land rich with visual images and echoes of the past. David joined the 22nd Battalion in camp at Mahdi, near Cairo.
We were reinforcements arriving in Egypt at that time. Egypt had quite a different feeling about it. This climate of Egypt, the heat and the sand. But it's really quite exciting because we'd come in this thing we were all doing together.
It was a time to recover after the battering in Crete. Time to rebuild the battalion. And for the new boys, time to get used to the severe conditions, the dryness, the dust, and the heat.
From midday, there was very little training done. The heat was so intensive, and almost, you could say, the enemy and the Allied forces try to avoid fighting in the midday sun.
Heat or not, the parades went on. Ceremonial occasions were seen as vital to building battalion spirit.
Well, I think the morale was good. Although they were a bit shattered by what had happened in Greece and Crete and their friends being killed and so on, yet that made them want to go on. Because we had a very good commanding officer, and that makes a big difference in good officers too. They're very much concerned for the welfare of men. They developed an esprit de corps, a brotherly spirit in which people are concerned for one another. You see, I'm part of all that. So a chaplain was there just to be a member of the family to start off with, in the battalion is very much a family, and he's concerned for the welfare of the men. And there may be those who are under some pressure because of something happening at home, or maybe they're not very well. He goes and visits them in hospital as he would back home.
To all soldiers, the chaplains were affectionately known as padres. They ranked as officers, and David was provided with a vehicle and a driver batman, Tim Fahey. The large station wagon enabled him to keep in contact with the men, wherever they were, and to carry a few extra comforts for the troops.
I had on board, for when we were static, I had writing paper, for instance, or I got hold of a radio so that we could listen to the news. And I had books too when we were stationary.
David and Tim provided stamps and paper to encourage the men to keep in touch with their families. The church tent was a place for the men to gather, and not just for the Padres' evening talks.
We had a big marquee there, and I used to make tea there for the boys at night. That's when we were recreation, taking things steady and a bit of a lull. Some of them got down the dumps, they hadn't got any letters from home or anything like that. Something went wrong, and buy a nice cup of tea at night and a game of cards and that.
My driver, Tim Fahey, he was a most loyal friend. Now, he was light heavyweight champion wrestler of New Zealand, amateur, and I happened to be boxing heavyweight on behalf of Canterbury in the university tournament. I was almost the finals, but not quite. Anyway, the boys thought this was a marvellous boxer and wrestler,
So, yes, David, he was very keen, and I said, righto, step your frame out, and he'll try you out too, I said. And much little difference in the weight, but that was nothing. And believe me or not, he shaped very, very good. But of course, he was quite a good boxer. Believe me or not, when he punched, he punched.
Sports days were one way of keeping up morale during the long periods of training. David enjoyed the physical aspects of army life, even being roped in as anchorman for the tug-of-war team. For the Kiwis, of course, a game of rugby was always the main drawcard, even when the field was more dust than grass. There was also time to explore the surrounding country, of the Egyptian people and their way of life. It was a cameraman's field day.
There are two places that were home away from home. One was Mardi, and there were kindly civilian people there, and they made us welcome at the Mardi Club. And there was a pool, which was very refreshing when you live in the desert.
But these were only brief respites. The relentless war continued to take its toll. David's work included service with No. 3 General Hospital, where the Padres played a special part.
It's, I suppose, partly to do with the spirit of the unit, of this family. But in particular, of course, when people are wounded, then there is the sister, nursing sister, there's the doctor, and the padre at least can get to know that patient as a friend. And if there's a need for prayer or for encouragement or to help through some time of stress, well, he's available.
They were very helpful in first aid, and they had this maturity and this inner strength that was a great help. And the chaps could talk to the padres when they couldn't really unburden themselves to anybody else.
It was hard to know how much their spirits were affected. I suppose we just carried on cheering them up all the time and saying, oh, come on, the worst things at sea than that. We used to make little extra things, try and make pikelets on a primus with a biscuit tin lid, a frying pan.
I always had the greatest respect for the nursing sisters. how they coped. Morning, noon and night, nothing was a problem to them.
We would get just word to say a convoy was coming. Now, they would come off a train, go into ambulances, and then come to us. Well, those men must have been terribly distressed that you would get broken, horribly mutilated-looking legs. Some, of course, had to come off. And some came in with their legs, had been amputated, and they were just dressed. We did see some terrible things, and we knew a lot of people weren't going to get better. Quite a few died going back on the hospital ship. And they were buried at sea, quite a number.
But out in the desert, the war went on. For Padre Thorpe, the real test was away from base camp.
The infantry is tough going. It's really hard work. They're a special breed of person, the infantryman. And they sleep in a hole in the ground, and they have anything they have, they've got to literally carry it with them on their back.
It was here that the Padres were most needed. The trauma of war and separation from home could be too much for some.
War, of course, is a very vicious thing, and men were under terrific stresses. And I know people that were well-educated, brilliant people, and chaps just that came from the ordinary, average home life, who just cracked under the strain of war. Others, some took their own lives. They just couldn't face up to it.
I can remember one night, a bloke called Sancho, he told me, he said, I've had enough of this. He said, I think I'll shoot myself. I said, what's wrong with you? I said, you know, you wouldn't do that. The enemy will shoot you if you want to be shot next time you go in. I can see him now running around the tent. Put three or three. So anyhow, Padre got hold of him, I think, and had a nice little talk to him and cheered him up. But that was his job. And some of his lectures at night, you know, anybody that was a bit dull, worried about something at home, they only had to go to this man, and he done the rest.
David's early activities were mostly back from the front lines, but they were not always out of shelling range. Maintaining contact with the troops in action often meant being in dangerous positions.
We had just been to the car and had a look at the wireless, and I just put the boot down. It must have been the glare of the glass with this 88mm gun from this airdrome out from Bardeer. He got a direct shot right at the tail of this big Ford car. So I can say we were very, very lucky indeed. But in so, his second shot, he got right onto our artillery, 25-pounders, up on the ridge. Killed the sergeant, Padre Thorpe, and myself, and Dr. Volkman. He come from Leaston. We buried these fellows that night.
At other times, the chaplains had even closer brushes with the enemy.
You've got to bear it in mind they had no infantry training, no field craft, being taught and trained how to take cover in different circumstances. That was all new to them, yet they did it all.
I remember, of course, that when we were at school, the cadets, we were taught to dash forward and lie down flat, and dash forward and lie down flat. So the first time, suddenly, people were shaving and just going to have their breakfast, and suddenly there was a burst of rifle fire. We were being attacked by an enemy patrol, I think it was.
A little post Joker was just across, or about 25 yards away from our car. He thought he was protected. Had a little dugout there, no bivvy or anything like that. Straight through the tummy. Next thing he let a yell out, and these Germans, they're everywhere.
And I thought, well, I've got to get across to the regimental aid post where the doctor is and be useful, I hope.
Poor old Padre, he drives the car away. That's how thickened the enemy was, he jumped in the car and drove off.
Because there's an obvious target, the station wagon, so we got out, and afterwards we saw a bullet hole in the door where the driver was. But I thought, well, I've got to do what I learned in the cadets, and I went flat down and ran flat down. I didn't see anybody else doing it, as I noticed, but when there are mortars and fire going on, when you just do what you can do. And so I got to the regimental aid post.
But anyhow, in our artillery done a great job, and that saved the day for us. In fact, I don't know how we went surrounded.
The Allies were still hard-pressed by the enemy. They were depressing times. The spectre of defeat hung over the desert. David needed a real inner strength for his part in supporting the troops. It was to be his trial in the wilderness.
I used to go out each early morning and think about the day and think about the men and their families back home and my own too, and reflect and pray. And oh dear, this desert seemed to symbolize the desolation of war and this breakdown of civilization in a terrible way. And of us too, being separated from home, the Japanese were coming down now. And I tried to pray, and I thought, well, I'm just sort of moaning to God. That won't do. I need to have faith in God's overruling by his power and love in all this. And so I stood up there in the desert and said, well, Lord, I believe. I put all this in your hands, and I know that your power and love will overrule all this for God. And I opened up my prayer book, the Psalm for this particular day. I am well pleased. The Lord has heard the voice of my prayer. Therefore will I call upon him as long as I live. And I thought that looked like a special message to me. Your prayer is heard. And I smiled. I said, well, it wouldn't be fair to ask a sign of you, would it? Ha ha. And I looked around this desolate desert. I looked down. There was a tiny little white flower, a little wax-like flower on one of these camel bushes. I thought, yes, that sounds pretty good. It looked like a sign, doesn't it? Something beautiful and living happening in this desert. And lo, there's another little flower, a little pink one. They weren't there before. But I thought, well, I suppose it's happening all over the place. So I stuck something in the ground so I'd remember where the place was. And I walked around for 100 yards around, not another flower anywhere. There's one place, these two beautiful little flowers. But you know, within a few days, the desert was ablaze with little flowers. But for me, it started just that one spot where I was praying so that I would know it was a word from God, if you like, that just in this desolation, there was the promise of life. How myriad times more in the desolation of human life, there was promise of a new beginning, of coming through the awful war out into something new.
And so his faith strengthened. David had a graphic message of encouragement for the troops. This was the Padre's most difficult task, particularly before going into battle.
Before all the actions, the Padre always had a little religious talk, a bit of a church parade, and he said his few words of comfort, very serious sort of stuff, and everyone appreciated that sort of thing.
I saw the poor devils going out all right. You'd see them going to him for confession and one thing another, even broad daylight down the gully and that. See, they never knew whether they were coming back or not.
I'd move around to a particular unit and they'd gather round and there would be communion before moving forward to meet the enemy. And of course it may seem strange to people that when you go off to shoot somebody else up, you must pray about it. But as Keith Elliott said, well, it's either us or them. It was a deadly serious business.
The troops, right at the front, were under relentless pressure, and Padres often took it on themselves to go out with extra supplies and words of encouragement.
If I went out in the daytime, of course, I would be a wonderful hero. I don't think they'd think silly ass and you get shot up and show where our positions are. Anyway, I got the correct compass reading, and off I set, and I got to the end of the 2000, and I called out here, cooey, and called out there, cooey. Not a sound. I thought I could hear the Germans over there somewhere. So I thought, what do I do? So I turned right angle right, as I learned to do in drilling, and I walked 50 paces, and I called out again. No sound. What do I do now? So I went right about 180 degrees, back 50 paces and the other 50 paces, and they loomed up in the darkness. Padre, how pleased to see you. And of course they'd come through the day, and we didn't know what tomorrow held. And so after talking of whatever we talked about, I said, well, would like a prayer before I go? He certainly would. There's a saying among soldiers, there are no atheists in slit trenches when the bombers come down, so on. Anyway, simple faith. And so I said, well, would like to receive communion? And they said, yes. I said, well, it doesn't matter what you are, Salvation Army, Roman Catholic or nothing, we receive together. And so the thought for me, and I think for some at least, expect to be sometime afterwards, it meant something, knowing that somehow God was with us. And so we knelt there in the desert. The Capuzzo, the election, that Rommel came round with his armour, and we were completely cut off in our battalion. German armour all round. The rest of the forces were not very far away, but they were well formed up, well defended and ready to attack, I suppose. But our intelligence, moving around the darkness, found a gap with all this great convoy of German army. And our battalion was mobilized and moved in convoy right in the darkness, not a light, of course, right through the German line, came out the other side, and then we were fired at by Indians. They thought they were Germans, but we soon told them.
In the heat of battle, the troops had to face again and again the ultimate cost.
It's rather interesting that a battle opens up, the shells are falling in front of you, and the infantry are walking behind them slowly. If you walk too fast, you get amongst them, you'd be killed. And you had to, and the chaps were going forward with fixed bayonets, Tommy guns. And of course, once that started, the enemy opened up in retaliation. Well, it's a terrific experience, a sad experience, because you can hear the screams of the dying and the wounded.
You don't talk much about it, but when you come to see your cobber get bowled over in front of you and you've got a plough on, you look down to think whether you can help them, but you can't stop because the enemy is right on your tail or you're forcing them out of it.
When things got tough, when action was really there, it was the padres that went out and helped the doctors, helped the stretcher bearers with the wounded, supplied water out of their water bottles to the wounded, supplied the odd cigarette and that sort of thing when it could be done. They were very special men, the padres, very brave and gallant people.
There was action, certainly. Cyril was one of the battles at that time. And our senior chaplain, Bishop Cherad, was captured and went off to be prisoner of war. I was just reading citation of Alwyn Warren, he just died the other day, and he was awarded the Military Cross for wonderful courage under those circumstances. And they were only worried he was such a big man, he's sure to catch a bullet. He was wounded, but he wasn't killed. But he was helping evacuate wounded.
Helping with the wounded was a harrowing and dangerous task. But perhaps the bleakest time for padres was spent dealing with the constant presence of death. The loss of men the padres had come to know well was deeply felt.
I was in my 1500 weight with my driver, and I came across a padre, and he had 4 bodies wrapped in grey army blankets, and I got the driver to stop the vehicle, and I said, "Can I help you, padre?" And the padre, he said yes, and the tears were streaming down his face. He said, "Will you help me to bury some of my boys?"
A bitter blow for David was finding an old friend, badly wounded.
There was a casualty clearing station underground. It was a position we'd taken over from the Italians. And I moved around down there. And whoever else I found, can't remember, but I do remember I found Arthur Gregg. I think he was a major in the he's certainly in the artillery. And his men in a particular group, I think, were all killed or wounded, and he left. He was firing this gun himself. And then his leg was shot off, and there he was down there, and I was told he wouldn't live. And so I was talking with Arthur. I knew him back in New Zealand. First of all, he used to come down to Christ College and judge the boxing. And then later on, when I was a student, I was up in that area and discovered him as a sheep farmer, and probably, I think he was churchwarden or something. He was involved in that sort of thing, and he became a friend. And here was Arthur Gregg. And so I talked with him. I said, "We'd like a prayer." He said he certainly would like to receive communion. He said yes. And so my little pocket communion set, and together we remembered Jesus' words as if they were spoken to us. "This is my body given for you. This is my blood shed for you." The unutterable love for God, whatever we're going through, and the certainty of God's love and faithfulness for those whom we love back home. And so this simple little act of prayer and faith of 2 men together.
The war was to continue for another 2 years, but David's service as army chaplain was cut short by ill health.
We said, "Well, you're not fit enough to go to the front line, so we advise you go back to New Zealand." And, of course, it's a thing that was very wonderful to do, to come back. And although I was sad not to carry on, yet there was life back in New Zealand. I had to go back and take up again. But we had time to adjust, to be together as a people on board ship, and to face the future and to come to terms with the past. I mentioned one chap, he was very disturbed. He had such a horrible memory of having to kill a German. And with a bayonet, you see. Well, you see this adjusting, and then we arrived in Wellington, and then we got on that old ferry boat, but crammed here and there, crammed there, and then we arrived in Littleton, and then we got on the train. You see, the ways of travel in those days, and then the train and through the tunnel, and we arrived at Christchurch railway station. And they had arranged so nicely, all this great crowd of men in uniform returning, and little islands of relatives all on the station. We were to move along, you see, and there.
David returned to his home and the love of his family, his part in the war over. But his close friend, Keith Harper, was to make the ultimate sacrifice along with many other New Zealanders. He was never to return to his homeland and loved ones.
Keith was killed at Casino, which was, of course, was a very costly operation. So he's especially to be remembered. I suppose, in a way, I'm proud that one of our chaplains, although we all went over there to give our lives if need be, but to give our lives in service and give our lives for death. It was just part of the whole show. But his offer, as it were, was accepted. And one of our chaplains gave his life. And so when we honour those who've gone on, I think of Keith. He was just one of a number of friends, a good friend. And there it is, and we used to talk over matters for fun, but also serious matters when we met together as vicars of two parishes. And as it says in the good book, one was taken, the other was left.